Chapter 5. The Man with the Plumed Hat. The mill in the fen of Kosel has 7 sets of millstones. 6 sets were always in use, and the 7th never. They called the millstones the dead stones. They stood right at the back of the grinding room. At first Krabat thought part of the cogwheel must be broken, or the main shaft was stuck, or some other part of the machinery damaged, until one morning, as he was sweeping the place out, he found a little floor lying on the floorboards around the chute that led down to the meal bin under the dead stones. On closer inspection, he found traces of fresh flour in the meal bin too, as if it had not been knocked out well enough after the work was done. Had the dead stones been grinding grain last night? If so, it must have been done in secret, while everyone was asleep. Or were they not all sleeping as soundly as Krabat himself last night? He remembered that the miller's men had turned up for breakfast, looking pale and hollow-eyed that day. Many of them were yawning, which struck him as suspicious now. Impelled by curiosity, he climbed the wooden steps up to the bin floor, where the grain was tipped from the sacks into the funnel-shaped hopper, from which it ran over the feed shoe and so down between the millstones. As the man tipped it in, a few grains were bound to be spilled. Only it was no grain of any kind lying there under the hopper, as Krabat expected. The things lying around the bin floor looked like pebbles at first sight. At second glance showed Krabat that they were teeth and splinters of bone. Horrified, the boy opened his mouth to scream, but he could not utter a sound. Suddenly Tonda was there behind him. Krabat had not heard him coming. He took the boy's hand. "What are you up after here, Krabat?" he asked. "Come along down before the master catches you, and forget what you have seen here. Do you hear me, Krabat? Forget it." Then he led Krabat down the steps. No sooner did the boy feel the boards of the grinding room floor under his feet than all he had seen that morning was wiped clean out of his mind. During the second half of February, a severe frost set in. The miller's men had to break the ice outside the sluice every morning. Overnight, while the wheels stood still, the water would freeze in the grooves of the pedals, forming thick crusts of ice, which had to be hacked away before the machinery could be started up. Most dangerous of all was the ice that formed in the trail race below the mill wheel. To keep it from damaging the wheel, 2 men had to climb down from time to time and hack it out, a job that none of them was particularly keen to do. Tonda made sure that no one shirked it, but when it was Krabat's turn, the haired journeyman climbed down into the tail race himself, saying it was no work for a boy who might hurt himself doing it. The others made no objection, except for Kitu, who grumbled as usual, and Lishku, who said anyone might hurt himself if he didn't look out. Whether by chance or not, stupid Yuro happened to be passing just then with a bucket full of pig's will in each hand. As he came past Lishko, he stumbled and splashed him with the pig's will from head to foot. Lishko swore, and Yuro, wringing his hands, assured him he could kick himself for being so clumsy. "Just think of how you will smell for the next few days," said he, "and it's all my fault. Oh dear, Lishko, don't be cross with me. Please don't feel. I feel so sorry for the poor pigs too." These days, Krabat often went out felling trees in the wood with Tonda and some of the others. As they set off in their sleigh, well wrapped up, hot oatmeal inside them, the fur caps crammed down on their foreheads, he felt so good in spite of the bitter cold that he envied no one in the world. The trees they felled had their branches lopped on the spot, were stripped to the bark, cut to the right length, and stacked up loosely with crossbars running between each layer to let the air in between the trunks, before they were taken to the mill next winter to be made into beams or sawn up for planks and boards. So the weeks passed by and nothing much changed in Krabat's daily life. He noticed a good many things that made him stop to think. For a start, it was odd that no customers ever came to the mill. Were there local farmers avoiding it? Yet the millstones ground every day and grain was always being poured into the hoppers. Barley and oats and buckwheat. Did the flour that was poured from the meal bins into sacks by day turning back into grain overnight? It seemed perfectly possible, Krabat thought. At the end of the first week in March, the weather changed. A west wind sprang up, driving grey clouds across the sky. "There'll be snow," muttered Quito. "I can feel it in my bones." And it did snow a little. Large watery flakes before the first raindrops came splashing down, and the snow turned to a downpour. "I'll tell you what," said Andros to Quito. "You'd better keep a tree fork to tell you what the weather will be. There's no relying on your bones these days." It rained cats and dogs. The rain poured down in torrents, whipping along the wind, melting snow and ice and making the mill stream rise alarmingly. The men had to go out in the rain to close the sluice and shore it up with props. Would the sluice gate hold against the rising water? "If it goes like this, we'll all be drowned along with the mill before the 3 days are up," thought Krabat. On the evening of the 6th day, the rain stopped. There was a break in the blanket of clouds, and for a few moments the rays of the setting sun shone through the dark dripping wood. The next day, Krabat had a frightening dream. Fire had broken out in the mill. The miller's men jumped up from their straw mattresses and clattered downstairs. But Krabat himself lay on his bed like a log of wood, unable to move from the spot. Flames were already crackling in the rafters, and the forest sparks were showering down on his face when he woke with a yell. He rubbed his eyes and yawned, looking round him. All of a sudden he froze, unable to believe his eyes. Where were the miller's men? Their beds were empty, deserted. They seemed to have left in a hurry, since the blankets were hastily pushed back and the sheets crumpled. Here was a jacket on the floor, there was a cap, a muffler, a belt, all clearly visible in the reflection of a red light flickering outside the gable window. Was the mill really on fire? Wide awake now, Krabat flung the window open, leaning out, but he saw a cart standing outside the mill. It was heavily laden. A canvas cover, dark with the rain, was stretched tightly over it. A team of 6 horses, every one of them as black as coal, was harnessed to it. Someone was sitting on the box, his collar pulled up high, his hat well down over his forehead, and all his clothes were black as night too. Only the feather he wore in his hat was bright red. It was wavering in the wind, like a flame flickering now, blown upward, glowing bright, now dropping as if it could go out. It was bright enough to light up the whole front yard of the mill. The miller's men were hurrying back and forth between the house and the covered cart, unloading sacks, dragging them into the mill, running out again. They worked in complete silence and feverish haste. Not a shout nor a curse could be heard, only the panting of the men, and now and then a snap as the driver cracked his whip right above their heads, so that they could feel the wind of it. That spurred them on to redouble their efforts. Even the master was hard at work, though he usually never did a hand's turn in the mill, never lifted his little finger. But tonight he was working with the rest, competing with his men, as if he were being paid for it. Once he stopped work for a moment and vanished into the darkness, not for a rest as Krabat suspected, but to run to the mill stream, move away the props and open the sluice. The water shot into the mill race, came rushing along and poured over into the tail race, surging and slapping. With a creaking sound the wheel began to turn. It was some time before it really got going, but then it went smoothly around, and now the millstones ought to start grinding, with a hollow, groaning noise, but there was only one set of stones working. That one set of stones worked with an unfamiliar sound. Krabat thought it seemed to come right from the back of the mill. A noisy clatter and thud, accompanied by an ugly squealing sound, which soon turned to a howl that tormented the listener's ears. Krabat remembered the dead stones, and his flesh began to creep. Meanwhile, work was still going on down below. The covered cart was unloaded, and the miller's men had a break, but not for long. The work went on again, though this time they were carrying the sacks back from the house to the cart. Whatever these sacks had contained, it was now being ground and was being brought back. Krabat meant to count the sacks, but he nodded off to sleep in the middle. At first cockcrow and the rumble of the cart wheels awakened him, and he was just in time to see the stranger drive away over the wet meadow, cracking his whip going toward the wood, and strange to say, heavily laden as it was, the cart left no tracks behind in the grass. A moment later the sluice was closed and the mill wheel ran down. Krabat jumped back into his bed and pulled the covers up over his head. The miller's men came, staggering upstairs, tired to death. They lay down on their beds in silence, only Kito muttering something about these accursed nights of new moon and a fiendish job. In the morning, Krabat was so tired he could hardly get up. His head was throbbing and he had a queasy feeling in his stomach. At breakfast he looked at the miller's men. They were sleepy and bleary-eyed and surly as they ate their oatmeal. Even Andrush was disinclined to make jokes. He stared gloomily at his plate and did not say a word. After breakfast, Tonda took the boy aside. "Did you have a bad night?" I'm not sure," said Krabat. "I didn't have to work, I was just watching, but what about you? Why didn't you wake me when the stranger came? I suppose you wanted to keep it secret from me, like all the other things that go on at this mill. I'm not to know about them. But I'm not deaf or blind, you know, and I'm no fool either. Not by any means." "No one said you were," protested Tonda. "But that's the way all act," cried Krabat. "You're playing some kind of game with me. Why don't you stop it?" "All in good time," said Tonda. "You'll learn about this mill and its master soon enough. The day and the hour are near. Then you know. Be patient until then."